When Jensen Huang, the leather jacket-wearing founder of Nvidia, sat down for an interview in early 2025, he made an admission that sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley. The company that once commanded 95% of China's semiconductor market now holds exactly zero. Not a declining share, not a struggling foothold, zero. Let that sink in for a moment. Nvidia didn't just lose market share in the world's second-largest economy, it was completely erased from the landscape. This wasn't a gradual decline. This was a technological earthquake that reshaped the global balance of power in artificial intelligence, and most people didn't even notice it happening. Jensen Huang himself acknowledged the staggering scale of what was lost. When asked about the Chinese market opportunity, he didn't sugarcoat it. "It's probably $50 billion this year," he said, his tone measured but heavy with implication. By the end of the decade, we're talking about a couple $100 billion. That's not just revenue. That's an entire economy. That's the foundation of America's technological supremacy crumbling in real time. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating and deeply troubling. This collapse didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened right after President Donald Trump stood beside Chinese President Xi Jinping, smiling for cameras, announcing what the media hailed as a new chapter in U.S.-China relations. New trade agreements, fresh diplomatic cooperation, a reset button on the world's most important bilateral relationship. Behind those handshakes and photo opportunities, something entirely different was unfolding. While American officials believed they were negotiating from strength, Beijing was executing a plan that had been years in the making. China's technology giants, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, the companies that power the digital lives of over 1 billion people, received clear instructions from the Chinese government. Media, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent headquarters exteriors, Chinese tech employees in office, Chinese government official giving directive to tech team, stop buying American chips, build domestic alternatives, cut the dependency, and that's exactly what they did. Today, Huawei's homegrown processors have replaced Nvidia's cutting-edge graphics cards in data centers across China. The country that was once America's largest customer for advanced semiconductors is now its most formidable competitor. The implications stretch far beyond one company's bottom line. What we're witnessing isn't just Nvidia's crisis. It's America watching its technological edge slip away, while China methodically constructs an entirely self-sufficient digital ecosystem. This is the story of how a single company's downfall reveals the fragility of American dominance. It's about billions of dollars evaporating overnight, desperate lobbying missions to Beijing that went nowhere, and a geopolitical chess match where the United States suddenly realized it might not be winning anymore. Stay with me, because what happens next will determine whether America remains the architect of the future or becomes a spectator watching someone else build it. The year 2025 was marketed to the world as a turning point. After years of escalating tensions, tariff wars, and bitter rhetoric, the United States and China were supposedly ready to find common ground. President Trump, ever the dealmaker, positioned his meeting with Xi Jinping as proof that his transactional approach to foreign policy could deliver results where traditional diplomacy had failed. The summit in Beijing was choreographed perfectly. Both leaders emerged speaking of mutual respect, economic cooperation, and the need for the world's two superpowers to work together. American media outlets ran headlines suggesting that the ice was finally thawing. Trade negotiators on both sides spoke cautiously but optimistically about new frameworks and pathways forward. For Nvidia and the broader American tech sector, this was supposed to be the moment everything changed. Perhaps, industry leaders hoped, this diplomatic warming would translate into eased export restrictions. Maybe China would once again become accessible to the semiconductors that power modern artificial intelligence. But here's what those optimistic projections missed. China had already moved on. The truth is that Beijing never intended for that summit to reopen its markets to American technology. The meeting was diplomatic theater, a way to project stability and reasonableness on the world stage, while domestic policies moved in the exact opposite direction. By the time Trump and Xi shook hands, Chinese procurement officers at the country's largest technology companies had already received their marching orders. Alibaba's cloud computing division, which once relied almost exclusively on Nvidia's H100 and A100 chips for training large language models, began systematically replacing its hardware with domestically produced alternatives. Baidu, the search giant that's become China's answer to Google, quietly shifted its entire AI infrastructure roadmap toward chips designed and manufactured within Chinese borders. Tencent, whose WeChat platform serves over 1 billion users, accelerated partnerships with Huawei and other local suppliers. This wasn't panic. This wasn't improvisation. This was the execution of a strategic plan that had been refined over years, waiting for the right moment to activate fully. The complete collapse of trust between Washington and Beijing had created an environment where dependence on American technology wasn't just risky, it was unacceptable. Chinese leaders had watched as successive U.S. administrations used export controls as weapons, cutting off access to critical technologies whenever geopolitical tensions flared. They'd seen Huawei nearly destroyed by sanctions. They'd watched ZTE brought to its knees by threats to cut off its supply chain. The lesson was crystal clear. Any country that depends on American semiconductors is vulnerable to American pressure. And China decided it would never be vulnerable again. For Nvidia, this represented nothing less than an existential threat wrapped in diplomatic niceties. The company that had built an empire on being irreplaceable suddenly found itself replaced. And no amount of presidential summitry could reverse what Beijing had decided was in its national interest. To understand why Nvidia's loss of China matters so profoundly, you first need to understand what Nvidia actually is, and why it's become the single most important company in the modern American economy. As of 2025, Nvidia's market valuation exceeded $5 trillion. Read that number again. $5 trillion. That makes it more valuable than Apple, the company that defined consumer technology for a generation. More valuable than Microsoft, which powers the software infrastructure of the entire business world. Nvidia stands alone at the summit of global capitalism, and there's a simple reason why. Artificial intelligence doesn't work without Nvidia's chips. The company's graphics processing units, GPUs, aren't just pieces of hardware. They're the physical substrate upon which the entire AI revolution is being built. Every major language model you've interacted with, from ChatGPT to Google's Gemini, was trained on Nvidia processors. Every autonomous vehicle learning to navigate city streets processes millions of calculations per second on Nvidia architecture. Every breakthrough in drug discovery, climate modeling, and materials science depends on computational power that Nvidia uniquely provides. Industry analysts estimate that more than 80% of global AI computing capacity runs on Nvidia's technology. That's not market dominance. That's a near monopoly on the future itself. The company doesn't just participate in the AI revolution. In many ways, it enables it. Which brings us to China's importance in this equation, and why losing that market isn't just a setback, it's potentially catastrophic. Before the export restrictions and political tensions reached their current intensity, China represented between 20 and 25% of Nvidia's total revenue. We're talking about $12 to $15 billion annually flowing from Chinese customers into Nvidia's balance sheets. In 2023, that percentage was even higher as China's technology giants raced to build the massive data center infrastructure needed to compete in artificial intelligence. Think about what that means in practical terms. Nearly a quarter of the revenue that funds Nvidia's research and development, that pays for the next generation of chip design, that allows the company to stay ahead of competitors, all of that came from China. Losing it isn't like losing any other international market. It's losing the fuel that keeps the entire engine running. The U.S. government understands these stakes perfectly, which creates a fascinating and deeply contradictory dynamic. Every presidential administration, regardless of party, has publicly championed export restrictions on advanced semiconductors to China. These controls are justified, correctly in many cases, as necessary for national security. The concern is straightforward. If Chinese military and intelligence agencies gain access to cutting-edge AI chips, they could develop capabilities that threaten American interests and allies. But here's the paradox that nobody wants to say out loud. Washington also desperately wants China to keep buying Nvidia chips, just not the most advanced ones, just not in quantities that would allow China to achieve parity with American capabilities. This approach, let's call it controlled dependency, seeks to maintain American technological leadership while still extracting billions of dollars from the Chinese market. The U.S. wants Beijing dependent enough to generate revenue, but restricted enough to remain behind. It's a business strategy dressed up in the language of national security, and the contradictions are tearing apart the very market America spent decades building. The most advanced Nvidia products like the H200 and the forthcoming Blackwell series are classified under strict export controls. These chips are deemed too strategic, too powerful, too potentially dangerous to allow into Chinese hands. Washington has drawn a line. You can buy our technology, but only the versions we decide won't threaten our dominance. From Beijing's perspective, this arrangement is both insulting and unsustainable. Why would any nation accept permanent technological subordination? Why would China continue enriching American companies while being denied the tools it needs to compete on equal terms? The answer, increasingly, is that it won't. Here's where the story takes a turn that honestly, most analysts didn't see coming, and one that should, well, terrify American policymakers. China doesn't actually need Nvidia's most advanced chips anymore. Let me explain how this happened, because it's both technically brilliant and, strategically devastating for American interests. When Washington imposed export restrictions on Nvidia's cutting-edge processors, the assumption was clear. Without access to the fastest, most powerful chips, China couldn't possibly keep pace in the AI race. American officials believed they'd created an insurmountable technological moat. Chinese engineers would be forced to work with inferior tools, and that handicap would translate into years, maybe decades, of American advantage. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. Chinese researchers discovered something that American policymakers had overlooked. You don't need a single incredibly powerful chip if you can coordinate thousands of slightly less powerful ones. This technique, known as parallel processing, isn't new in theory. But Chinese engineers have refined it to a degree that's genuinely impressive, even to their competitors. Here's how it works in practice. Instead of relying on one H100 chip running at maximum capacity, Chinese data centers deploy clusters of mid-tier GPUs, processors that fall below export control thresholds, and network them together to function as a single, massive computational brain. By distributing the workload across thousands of these chips operating in perfect synchronization, they can achieve processing speeds that rival, and in some cases exceed, what Nvidia's most restricted technology can deliver. Yes, this approach requires more physical chips. Yes, it consumes more electrical power. But China has both in abundance. The country has massive manufacturing capacity for semiconductors at the 7-nanometer scale, which is advanced enough for AI applications, even if it's not quite cutting edge. And Chinese energy infrastructure, particularly in regions where renewable power is plentiful, can supply the electricity these chip farms demand. The result is genuinely remarkable. Chinese labs are now training large language models, the kind that power conversational AI and advanced automation, at speeds that approximate or match what American companies achieve with Nvidia's flagship hardware. The performance gap that export controls were supposed to create has been largely closed through sheer engineering ingenuity and industrial scale. Huawei's Ascend 910B processor has become the cornerstone of this strategy, These chips, designed entirely in China and manufactured using domestic processes, are being deployed in massive parallel formations across Chinese data centers. Baidu's Ernie AI model, which competes directly with ChatGPT in the Chinese market, runs primarily on these homegrown chips. Tencent's next-generation cloud AI infrastructure relies on the same technology. Even Alibaba, which once depended almost exclusively on Nvidia, has shifted its entire roadmap toward domestic alternatives. So while Washington continues debating what level of technology China should be allowed to access, Beijing has simply rendered the question obsolete. They've stopped asking for permission and started building their own path. This should be a five-alarm fire for American policymakers, but the full implications haven't fully registered yet. Export controls were supposed to slow China down. Instead, they've accelerated the very self-sufficiency that American strategy was meant to prevent. Every restriction pushed China closer to independence. Every denied sale gave Chinese companies more incentive to invest in domestic alternatives. And now, those alternatives are good enough. Not just adequate, competitive. Jensen Huang is not a man who panics easily. He spent decades building Nvidia from a scrappy startup into the most valuable company on Earth. He's navigated technology transitions, market crashes, and fierce competition. But throughout 2025, Huang has been engaged in what can only be described as a desperate, high-stakes lobbying campaign to save his company's access to the Chinese market. His actions reveal something we rarely see from American corporate titans: open acknowledgement that they need China more than China needs them. The campaign began in Washington. Starting in January 2025, Huang became a fixture in the halls of power, meeting repeatedly with President Trump's economic and national security teams. He sat down with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, National Economic Council Director Larry Kudlow, and even hardline trade hawks like Peter Navarro. These weren't casual courtesy calls. They were intensive lobbying sessions where Huang made an argument that should have been obvious, but apparently needed repeating. Losing China means losing the AI race. Huang presented what he called the Silicon Rebalance Framework, essentially a proposal for controlled resumption of Nvidia chip exports to China under strict monitoring and verification protocols. The plan, according to industry sources who saw it, emphasized that Nvidia's exclusion from China threatened $6 billion in immediate annual sales. But Huang's pitch went deeper than just revenue. He argued that losing that income would undermine the $10 billion Nvidia invests yearly in research and development, the very R&D that keeps America ahead in artificial intelligence. The message to Trump was blunt: if Nvidia loses China, America loses its technological edge, because Nvidia's dominance isn't just good for shareholders, it's the foundation of American AI supremacy. Trump, ever the businessman, appeared genuinely interested. He understands revenue. He understands market share. He understands that American companies need customers. But his national security team pushed back hard. Advisors argued that any technological concessions would hand Beijing strategic advantages that could come back to haunt the United States. The intelligence community reminded everyone in the room about Chinese military applications of AI, about surveillance systems, about weapons development. The bureaucratic paralysis was complete. Nobody wanted to be the official who approved the export that later appeared in a Chinese weapons system. Realizing that Washington wasn't going to move fast enough, or perhaps at all, Huang made an extraordinary decision. He would go straight to Beijing. In May 2025, Huang traveled to China for meetings that were closely watched by both governments. He met with officials from the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology and the National Development and Reform Commission, the agencies that control China's technology policy. He also held private discussions with executives from Huawei, Baidu, and Tencent, the very companies that once depended on Nvidia but have since pivoted to domestic chip suppliers. Chinese state media covered the visit with careful language about symbolic cooperation and technological exchange. But people in the room painted a different picture. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a plea for re-entry into a market that had already decided to move on. Chinese officials were polite, even cordial, but they made no commitments. The message Huang received was clear and unambiguous. China's self-sufficiency program, backed by hundreds of billions of dollars in government investment, is permanent. It's not a negotiating position. It's settled policy. Nvidia could apply to sell chips that comply with export regulations, officials told him. But the era of Chinese dependence on American technology is finished. Beijing isn't interested in going backward. Huang returned to the United States empty-handed. Worse than that, he returned with confirmation that the door isn't just temporarily closed. It's been bricked over from the inside. The bitter irony in Nvidia's collapse is that American policy helped create it. David Sachs, President Trump's advisor on AI and cryptocurrency, has been one of the few voices inside the administration willing to publicly acknowledge what's happening. Throughout 2025, Sachs has warned repeatedly that China is catching up faster than almost anyone in Washington wants to admit. More troubling, he's pointed out that Beijing has become remarkably adept at evading export controls through front companies, third-party suppliers, and the parallel processing techniques we discussed earlier. In one particularly blunt assessment, Sachs argued that China might be only months, not years, behind the United States on key AI capabilities. He suggested that rigid export bans could actually accelerate Chinese self-reliance rather than prevent it, precisely the outcome we're now witnessing. That public warning set the stage for a year of intense lobbying and increasingly desperate diplomacy. Trump and Huang were in regular contact as the CEO tried to restore access to Chinese sales, but Congress and national security officials grew more suspicious with each conversation. Bipartisan groups of senators warned Huang before his China trips to avoid any contacts that might undermine American export rules. Some administration figures resisted any arrangement that might allow advanced capabilities to leak to military end users. That distrust created a complete political logjam. Business interests pushing for market access ran directly into national security gatekeepers worried about strategic risk. Nobody could agree on where to draw the line, so nothing moved forward. Then Beijing turned the screws even tighter. In mid-2025, Chinese regulatory authorities opened preliminary investigations alleging that Nvidia had violated antitrust rules tied to previous acquisitions and partnerships. China's internet regulator instructed major firms to halt purchases of specific Nvidia models. While these inquiries continued, and it's worth noting they've dragged on without resolution, state agencies quietly asked companies to cancel or pause Nvidia orders, effectively blacklisting certain products from government procurement lists. Whether these investigations have merit is almost beside the point. They serve a strategic function, making it legally risky and politically problematic for Chinese companies to continue buying American chips, even when they're technically allowed to. Nvidia found itself squeezed from both sides. Washington wouldn't lift export restrictions. Beijing was making it harder to sell even the chips that were supposedly permitted. The company was caught in a vice with no easy escape. The numbers tell a story of catastrophic loss. Nvidia has quietly stopped including China in its official revenue forecasts, a tacit admission that the company no longer expects to make meaningful money there. It's the kind of accounting decision that speaks volumes about how completely the situation has deteriorated. Industry analysts estimate the total financial damage from lost Chinese sales and unsold inventory at approximately $5.5 billion. That's not a projection. That's what's already gone. Nearly a quarter of Nvidia's global data center revenue has simply evaporated. To put that in perspective, $5.5 billion is more than the entire annual GDP of some small nations. It's the kind of loss that would sink most companies. Nvidia is surviving because its dominance in American and European markets remains unchallenged, but make no mistake, this is a wound that changes everything. Wall Street, for its part, has tried to maintain confidence. Stock prices remain elevated because investors believe in Nvidia's long-term dominance in AI computing. The company's position in American and European data centers seems unassailable. Demand from companies building AI infrastructure is insatiable. But fundamentals tell a more complicated story. Nvidia has expanded manufacturing capacity across South Korea, Taiwan, and even the United States, anticipating demand that now has nowhere to go. None of these markets can absorb the production volume that China once consumed. Before the export bans, China accounted for more than a third of global AI chip consumption. That's not a market you simply replace. Think of it this way: if you build a factory expecting to serve 1 billion customers and suddenly lose 300 million of them, you don't just find 300 million new customers elsewhere. They don't exist. The scale that made China valuable to Nvidia is exactly what makes it irreplaceable.